Dr. Charles Lin, who is retired, but he's really was previously the Director General of Atmospheric and Climate Science and Environment Canada, Director General, I guess, and a whole variety of things. So over to you, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. So as Gordon indicated, I've retired 3 years ago, and this is, if you want, one of my retirement projects. Next slide, please. I will go over the project team members and make a few remarks to set the context. That's the introduction. And then one of the key messages is individual versus collective actions that are needed for Canada to reach net zero. We will then focus on two key sectors. First is the energy sector, and then the financial sector. And then the last 2 points will be on how Canada would reach net zero by 2050 and the mission of my project. Next slide, please. So to introduce the team members, I retired 3 years ago after a 38-year career in academia and government, 27 years at U of T and McGill, and 11 years at Environment and Climate Change Canada. And the last 10 years of my career were spent in ECCC, and I was responsible for the management of the weather science, climate science, and air quality science for the department. James Lin has a PhD in energy economics from the University of Alberta, and he is also a team member. Stephen Foon has sustainability expertise, and he has worked in this capacity with Mitsubishi Electric. So I spent last year, 2019, at Harvard, and I was a fellow of the Advanced Research Initiative, which is a program that Harvard designed for people who have had some leadership experience and who want to contribute back to society. And for me, the contribution is in the form of this project. So this project was refined when I was a fellow there. Next slide, please. Now, net zero is a scientific concept. I think you're all familiar with it. This is the idea where emissions of CO2 have to be balanced by removal. And this is really at the heart of how we might reach 2 degrees C, 1.5 degrees C, all these goals that IPCC have advanced. 83%, a vast majority of Canadians are extremely concerned, very concerned, or quite concerned about climate change from a recent Abacus survey. So there's a lot of concern out there. One of the challenges is, what can I do? And I'm frequently faced with that question. And when Trudeau was re-elected, he had committed, one of his election promises on his platform was to have the country reach net zero by 2050. So I'm going to approach this talk with just showing several key numbers. So 83% is the first one, 2050 is the second one. And there have been several federal initiatives in the last few years which try to position the country to move towards this goal. The Canadian Institute for Climate Choices is an organization that is a direct result of this promise, and I believe the next speaker is from this institute, so I won't say much more about it. Generation Energy is sponsored by Natural Resources Canada, and it's a forum for Canadians to discuss input how Canada would reach a low carbon state. Low Carbon Cities Canada is seed funding from the federal government, 43 million, I believe, to 7 cities across Canada to accelerate urban climate solutions. So there have been federal initiatives that aim to help the country to reach this goal. Next slide. Individual actions. And I'll start with a personal situation. My wife and I, and before our children left, the 3 kids, 5 of us, we were carless. We were without a car since 1991. And since then, we've lived in Paris, France, a year when I was on sabbatical leave, and then the rest of the time in Montreal and Toronto. I still live in Toronto, so it's been 29 years without a car and still counting. We raised 3 children. In today's language, I would have made a lifestyle choice to reduce individual carbon footprint. 29 years ago in 1991, people didn't talk this way, and the goal was really to save some money to pay down our mortgage and to be environmental at the same time. Okay? And this has worked. So the next bullet shows how difficult it is to scale up individual actions like this. According to scientific research, you save, by going without a car, you save 2 tons of CO2 emissions per year. And then to juxtapose that, GHG emissions from personal vehicles in the city of Toronto in 2016 is 5 million. 32 million tons from cars, light trucks, and motorcycles in Ontario in 2016. 143 million from road transportation in Canada in 2016. So you can get an idea of the magnitude of the task at hand to scale up individual actions. You have to scale up by 7 orders of magnitude, from 2 to 10 million plus. Right. So, and this is not going to happen on its own. That's pretty clear, because people make choices based on individual preference and also incentives. And incentives come in the form of carrots and sticks. An example of a carrot is a carbon tax. An example of a stick is cash contributions to help buy electric vehicles, for example. And when Doug Ford came into government in Ontario and removed the incentives for purchase of EVs, EV sales immediately declined. So the main message here is that it is very, very difficult to scale up individual actions based on lifestyle choices. You need to transform individual actions to collective actions. Next slide. So let's turn to the energy sector. Fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. 2 numbers. The first one is 85%. 85% of the world primary energy consumed in 2018 come from coal, oil, and gas. And second number, coincidentally, is also 85%. Canada's primary energy produced in 2016 is in coal, oil, and gas. Canada also ranks 6th in primary energy productions in 2015 worldwide. 22% of Canada's total goods exports is related to energy. And so in other words, Canada is an energy producing country. So that's a conundrum. The world is using a lot of energy in the form of coal, oil, and gas, and Canada is good at producing coal, oil, and gas. So the second bullet, or the third bullet, focuses on the international and Canadian scenes. In the last 6 months or so, big internationals have announced ambitions to reach net zero by 2050. BP, Shell, and Total have all announced within the last 6 months. And a major player that has stayed on the sidelines is ExxonMobil, where they have decided to not do so. Now, it's also interesting to note, in view of the COVID developments, that none of these 3 have retrenched this ambition. And Shell, in fact, announced the ambition after COVID. On the domestic scene, Centrivis has targeted net zero by 2050. Suncor has no formal net zero targets. Instead, they aim to reduce emission intensity. This is the amount of GHG emitted per barrel of oil. And CNRL, Canadian Natural, has long-term aspirational goal to reach net zero. So all this to say that the fossil fuel industry is making some pretty strong statements, right, about net zero. Now, the precise pathways to reach that is not well defined, other than a reliance on technologies which are not fully developed, or at least not developed to the scale where it can be scaled up to the magnitude required. For example, carbon capture and storage. And there's also reliance on policy instruments such as carbon pricing, trading, and offsetting schemes. Next slide. In the financial sector, there's an emerging driver known as ESG, environmental social governance. So this is a corporate social responsibility, CSR, impact investing, green investing. It's known in various names, but loosely, it is really the consideration of environmental factors in investing. BlackRock, the largest asset management company in the world with assets of $7 trillion. Their CEO, Larry Fink, announced in a letter to fellow CEOs, climate risk is an investment risk. Every government, company, and shareholder must confront climate change. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of England, led an open letter on climate-related financial risks. And he says on the transition to net zero by 2050, this transition requires a massive reallocation of capital. If some companies and industries fail to adjust to this new world, they will fail to exist. Strong words. So if you follow the money, right, there's a fair bit of emerging considerations on ESG, and of course the fossil fuel industry is funded to a large extent by the banks. Next slide. So for Canada to reach net zero by 2050, we for sure need government leadership. Transitions away from the current regime of heavy fossil fuel use. Recall, 85% of the world's use of energy comes from fossil fuel. In industrial, transportation, agricultural sectors. So we need to transition away from this current regime. The magnitude of the transition and their impact on society are unprecedented. And the public is not aware of this, right? Or much of the public is not aware of the scale of the task at hand. And the transitions would only happen with government intervention. 10 million Canadians are not going to decide to go without a car, just like that, right? 1 or 2 might, maybe 10 or 12 might, but 10 million, no, that's not going to happen, right? The second important component is a constructive engagement of the fossil fuel industry. And I think they are essential actors to determine pathways to reach net zero. There are pathways, there are ambitions announced, but as I indicated earlier, the precise pathways are not well defined.
This is your timekeeper, 1 minute.
Thank you. And we need to scale up individual actions. And I put to city levels here because the cities are very active in developing urban climate solutions. And people live in cities, people identify with cities, and people identify also with their carbon footprint, which is intimately tied to city initiatives, such as more effective mass transportation, more efficient buildings and homes, and so on. Final slide. The project mission. I already mentioned the gaps. The public is not aware of the magnitude of the task to reach net zero. Going without a car, eating less red meat, using your using your dryer less often, these are all worthwhile initiatives. But on their own, they will not help us reach net zero by 2050. Constructive engagement of the fossil fuel industry is essential. I don't believe that comments like all is dead would be helpful in engaging the fossil fuel industry. I have assembled a team, James and Stephen, working part-time on this. Our project mission is to widen and advance pathways for Canada to reach net zero. And we do this by harvesting the power of collective actions of informed citizens through cities. So there's a role here in informing the citizens. And since we all live in cities, or many of us live in cities, and cities are doing good work in formulating urban climate solutions. So we've decided to go through cities on this. And we want to create opportunities to synergize corporate ambition and public actions. By corporate, we mean the fossil fuel industry and the banking industry. Right? So these are ambitious goals, but I think the need is there, and I and the team will work on this. So I'll stop there. Thank you,
Charles.